Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Hashing Out the Law. On this episode, I have with me a special guest. I have Karine Kardajian. Did I say the last name right?
Kardajian. Close.
Kardajian. How are you, Karine?
Good. How are you, Arash?
Good. I asked Karine to come on to talk about bankruptcy. She's a bankruptcy lawyer. And as you know, because of the effects of COVID-19, a lot of businesses have declared bankruptcy. Some have declared outright bankruptcy. Some have declared bankruptcy protection. So I wanted to listeners and the viewers to learn a little bit about it, and myself too. I want to learn a little bit more about it and to know the difference between the different kinds of bankruptcy. So Karine, let's start with talking about you a little bit, your background and what you do and how long you've been doing this before we get right into the bankruptcies. You've been an attorney since 2011, am I correct?
2012.
2012. Sorry about that. Go ahead. Tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
Sure. So my primary law practice has been focused on bankruptcy, debt relief, and I got started in there before I even was licensed. So when I was in law school, I externed for 2 bankruptcy judges, and they just happened to be amazing people who were very empathetic and made me kind of fall in love with that part of the law and how you get to help people. And you get to see results pretty quickly, unlike, let's say, PI cases that can drag on for a couple of years before you see results. And so I've been focusing on that, and recently it's been, very much in the spotlight, and our phones have been ringing like crazy and people are worried. And so we're trying to put some information out there to help people.
Right. And that's the exact reason that I wanted you to be on this episode so we can talk about it, is because it's all over the news now because of everything that's happening with the economy. Now, some companies have declared bankruptcy outright. I think Sioux Plantation is one of them. And then I heard Neiman Marcus, some other people, they're declared bankruptcy. Could you tell us the bankruptcy that exists and what companies can do besides declaring outright bankruptcy?
So they're all essentially filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy most of the times. Every now and then you see businesses filing Chapter 7 bankruptcies. But some of them will choose within that Chapter 11 to reorganize. And so what they'll do is they'll see maybe certain locations are bringing in more money, maybe certain locations it doesn't make sense to keep them open. So oftentimes they'll kind of downsize, they'll cut costs, and they'll enter into agreements with their largest creditors in an effort to reorganize and kind of save the business and keep it going. And then in other times, they'll just call it quits.
I'm going to stop you there and let's back up a little bit more. You mentioned Chapter 11 and Chapter 7. What is the difference? So let's say I'm a business and I'm deciding to take the next step and declare bankruptcy, and I have Chapter 7, Chapter 11. What is the difference, and why would I choose one over the other?
So Chapter 11s are very, very expensive. The initial retainer for most of those starts at about $20,000 or so. I don't do Chapter 11 work. A lot of our colleagues do. It just is something that wouldn't really make sense unless you're kind of determined to save the business and keep it going and reorganize. And we usually see that with larger businesses that can afford everything that comes with that. With the Chapter 7, there's kind of a split. Some attorneys don't really recommend filing corporate Chapter 7s at all because you cannot get a discharge for a corporation. But in certain situations, if there's, let's say, assets that the trustee can liquidate, or sometimes it makes it easier to later on dissolve the company, sometimes the 7 makes sense. What we see with a lot of smaller business owners is that they also personally guaranteed on a lot of the business debt. So just a corporate bankruptcy isn't going to be enough to help them because they need a personal bankruptcy in that case to take care of their personal liability on it. And then as far as the corporate Chapter 7, we would have to see whether that makes sense or not in their situation.
Okay. So from my understanding, a Chapter 11 bankruptcy is when I want to continue doing business, but I can't afford to pay my bills. So I'm asking to be declared bankrupt and reorganize and keep the business going, like having a clean slate. Is that correct?
Yeah, pretty much. And that's kind of similar to what we do, let's say, with Chapter 13s in terms of individual reorganizations. Let's say if they fell behind on mortgage payments and their house is facing foreclosure. So it's kind of similar to a Chapter 13, but more geared toward businesses or very, very high valued individuals, right? Like you'll see celebrities file Chapter 11 and things like that.
Okay. So an individual can actually file for Chapter 11 too, but
Yeah.
like you said, it's for high valued persons, correct?
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, my guess is a lot of these celebrities that are filing the Chapter 11s probably also have a lot of businesses associated in there. So it just makes sense to do an 11.
And then you mentioned Chapter 7 and Chapter 13. So Chapter 13 and Chapter 7, what is the difference between those as compared to Chapter 11?
So a Chapter 7, you can again do both business and individual. You gotta see if it makes sense to do a business Chapter 7 in the first place. But let's say if we're talking about a typical individual with credit card debts, it's for most of these people, like lower income, lower asset, it's favorable for them to do a Chapter 7 because it's a quick process, 3 to 4 months, and they get a fresh start. They don't have to pay back anything to their creditors. They kind of get a fresh, clean slate. For Chapter 13s, that usually makes sense if you have secured debt. Let's say you have tax debt that's not dischargeable, you can pay that off in the Chapter 13, or you can catch up on your mortgage payments if you can't do a loan mod, or simply you make too much money or you have way too much equity and we can't protect that in a Chapter 7. So you're going to be in a Chapter 13 for 3 to 5 years and you're going to pay back a certain portion to your creditors, if it makes sense. For a lot of Chapter 13 clients, I have a conversation with them where if it's not a situation like I'm saving a home or whatever, if it's just unsecured debt like credit cards, if they're going to end up repaying more than 50% back in a Chapter 13, then we have a conversation of whether maybe it makes more sense to just settle out the debt instead, for me to negotiate that and avoid a bankruptcy filing altogether.
I see. Okay, so a Chapter 7, and correct me if I'm wrong, Chapter 7 is when I'm just wiped out and I can't carry on anymore. But a Chapter 13 is I want to save something in the bankruptcy, and it's like a temporary bankruptcy, for lack of a better term.
It's essentially a reorganization of your debts for the next 3 to 5 years based on your disposable income at the end of each month.
I see. All right, and then you mentioned that you usually don't do bankruptcy Chapter 11s, so you do Chapter 7 and 13, right? Yes. Which one is the most common one?
In my practice, Chapter 7 is very common. I think it also just depends geographically where you are. So I have, my main office is in Van Nuys. I also have offices in Irvine and Glendale. I'd say that the bulk of people that are calling me in Van Nuys are for Chapter 7. And the majority of people that are calling me in Irvine are primarily either Chapter 13 or debt settlement clients.
I see. Okay, so let's say I call you and I say, I need help. I have a bunch of credit card debt, and I need you to tell me what to do. What's the next step? What do we do after that?
So we have an in-depth consultation, usually over the phone or via Skype or Zoom or whatever it is, where I ask detailed questions about the extent of basically your assets and your income. And if you're married, we have to take into consideration your spouse's assets and income as well, even if you're the only one filing for bankruptcy. And that helps me determine whether we can do a Chapter 7 or whether you don't qualify, or maybe it doesn't make sense in your case. But if you're calling me with just credit card debt, not a situation where I'm trying to save your home or save you from tax debt, then we're going to try to see if we can squeeze you into a Chapter 7. And so there's something called a means test in place, and that takes into account your gross income for the past 6 months, prior to filing. There's a calculation that's put in place, and then we annualize that income based on a 6-month average. And if you're below what the California median household is for your family size, then you qualify at the first step. So just to give like rough numbers out there, for a household of one, if you're making under 60K a year gross, then you qualify income-wise at the first step for the Chapter 7. The more restrictive stuff that I come across is people with assets, right? So if you have a house, and if you're not a senior citizen, not disabled, anything like that, then as a single person, you're only entitled to about 75,000 of equity protection in your home, and as a married couple, 100,000. So in California, especially in recent years with the market being up, most people have way more equity than that, and then we're not able to protect that. And if we file a Chapter 7, then they have to pay back whatever is not exempt. So in those cases, it might make more sense to settle it out or to put them in a lower percentage Chapter 13.
Okay. I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Married couple, I'm married, I want to file bankruptcy. And you said we would take my partner, my wife's income and everything into consideration. So I file bankruptcy. Will that affect her and her credit as well, just because we're married?
No, it generally shouldn't. So her social security number doesn't go anywhere on the petition. Her income is included because we're in a community property state, essentially. So we might have to produce her pay stubs and show them to the trustee or the court just to verify income. And then there will be joint tax returns that are submitted to the trustee for review. So they'll kind of see her information, but it does not get reported on her credit because it's just associated with your name and your social security number.
Okay, that makes sense. Have husband and wife jointly filed for bankruptcy before?
Yeah, it happens all the time, and I think it makes more sense, in joint cases because you pay one fee essentially. I don't really charge much extra whether it's a couple or a single person, because the only extra work is me inputting one other set of income for a person. So usually it's much more cost effective to do it together.
I see.
But some couples opt not to do it that way. If they want to, if one spouse doesn't really have a lot of debt, they want to preserve at least one person's credit for the purposes of later on rebuilding, buying a house, and things like that.
Makes sense. Earlier you mentioned corporations. When I say corporations, I'm talking about smaller corporations. I created a corporation. Now I'm going to go bankrupt. But unlike your example, I didn't personally guarantee the corporation, right?
Mm-hmm.
If the corporation is going bankrupt, but I didn't personally guarantee it, will that affect me, or will that just be a corporate bankruptcy?
I would think that it would be just a corporate bankruptcy, and you do need to make sure you properly dissolve the corporation. I think a lot of people kind of just walk away from it and they forget that very important part. But for that, I usually refer that out to a colleague of ours, Ala Tanina, who she's a bankruptcy attorney as well, but on top of it, she does kind of like asset protection, corporate formation, dissolvement. So, and tax law, which I think is very important when you're dissolving things. So I think she would be maybe a possible next guest of yours or something. She has a ton of knowledge to offer on how to kind of properly go about all of that to protect you personally best.
Well, I think I might have to bring her on to ask her that.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this. Same example, but reverse. So the corporation is not filing bankruptcy. I'm personally filing bankruptcy. The corporation, I haven't guaranteed the corporation. Will my personal bankruptcy filing affect my corporation?
Generally not. So let's say you have like a small business, right? Is that what we're talking about? So
yes.
A lot of people are able to preserve their small business and file bankruptcy for their personal debts and continue running their small business, which is basically their main source of income. And we just have to properly disclose that income. You got to have proper profit and loss statements, make sure everything matches up in your business records. There are certain fields where I know there's some sort of prohibition. So for example, I had a client who was like, she worked on merchant accounts, like credit card processing merchant accounts. And apparently several of the agreements she has with her clients have language in there that says, if you ever file for bankruptcy, we have the right to terminate our relationship with you.
Right.
So you gotta look out for stuff like that. But in a more general setting, a lot of our Chapter 7 clients are indeed small business owners, and they continue to operate their business if it's profitable, and just get rid of their personal liabilities.
Okay, makes sense. So if people want to get in touch with you, how would they do that?
So they can go on my website, which is kelawfirm.com, or best way is to shoot me an email. So it's Karine, Karine, at kelawfirm.com, or they can give me a call at 323-426-8300. I also actually have a lot of people who send me messages on Facebook and Instagram. On Instagram, I'm the Debt Fairy, and I'm happy to answer people's questions and help however I can.
Great. We'll make sure to include all those links in the podcast description, and on the video and on the YouTube channel. We'll have it all in the comments so everybody can get a hold of you. So let's talk about some of these companies. Let's talk about Neiman Marcus. Do you know what kind of bankruptcy they filed and what their plans are?
I believe that they are doing a Chapter 11 reorganization. So I believe they're going to be looking at what stores were profitable, what stores don't really make sense to keep open, and they're going to downsize and continue operating. That's my understanding of it as it currently stands.
But Neiman Marcus fans don't have to worry about Neiman Marcus not.
I don't think they do, and I'm a Neiman Marcus fan myself, so I really hope I'm right about this.
Awesome. All right, that's great. I have so many questions to ask you, but I don't want to take up your time and take you on tangents. Now, do you think, in your opinion, well, you kind of answered that. You said your phone's been ringing off the hook recently, but do you think that more and more people are going to end up in bankruptcy because of what's happening with the economy and the coronavirus?
I do think so, unfortunately. So what happened is when the lockdown first started in March, mid-March, I started getting 20, 30 calls a day. It was kind of crazy because everyone was panicking. People got laid off. Unemployment hadn't hit yet. We didn't know about the extra, well, that hadn't come out yet, the extra $600 a week in federal unemployment supplemental benefits. And what we started doing is I started putting out a lot of like webinars and informational videos, and so did a lot of my bankruptcy colleagues in LA. And we were basically urging people kind of not to panic and to see how things play out and not to rush into a bankruptcy filing, because we started seeing kind of these like vulture ads, right? Like file for bankruptcy, file for bankruptcy. And that's what we wanted to avoid. And luckily, a lot of people listened. And I actually got a call back from a lot of people that said, you know what, my unemployment worked out. And a lot of people right now are getting more on unemployment than they were at their regular minimum wage job because they're getting the extra $600 a week. So my hope is that for some of these people, these benefits, and they won't have to file bankruptcy. But we also understand that for a lot of people, it's kind of just damage done, and they're going to be forced into a bankruptcy. And my prediction is, unless something changes with the the mortgage forbearance programs, where a lot of them were saying you can skip 3 months of payments, and forgot to mention the part where you have to make it up on month 4.
Right.
If they're not going to grant people some sort of a forbearance where they're going to add it to the back end of the loan, or if they're not going to do loan mods, then I think a lot of people are going to be forced into Chapter 13 bankruptcies to save their home from foreclosure.
It's definitely going to be interesting times. While some questions came to my mind, I have for you. What debts are not cannot be wiped out in a bankruptcy? I think student loans is one of them.
Student loans is a big one. So there is a way technically to discharge it. You can file a bankruptcy, you can file an adversary within your bankruptcy, claim undue hardship, and if you prevail on that, they're discharged. But it's very rare. If it's a legitimate student loan, like it's not one of those, for-profit schools that shut down or something like that, then it's difficult to discharge that unless you can show some sort of like permanent disability, a true undue hardship where you're never going to be able to afford a payment. I think for most people, what makes more sense is to get on, like if you have federal loans, to get on income-based repayment instead. And sometimes those can be very low payments and manageable. Other debts that are not dischargeable are domestic support obligations. So if you're behind on child support and things like that, that's not dischargeable. If you were driving drunk, so if there's a DUI issue and you hit somebody, you injured them, that's not dischargeable, obviously for like public policy reasons. And then tax debt if it's newer. So a lot of people think all tax debt is non-dischargeable, but actually if the taxes were due at least 3 years ago, filed at least 2 years ago, assessed 240 days ago, there's like a very specific formula. Income taxes, absent any kind of fraud or issues like that, those can be discharged. And then there's avenues for the trustee or the creditors to argue non-dischargeability of certain debts. Like if, let's say, there was fraud, misrepresentation, but for those, they would have to file an adversary proceeding or a lawsuit within the bankruptcy. Those are not automatically non-dischargeable.
I see. So not all the debts are automatically dischargeable.
Right.
How long does a bankruptcy stay on your credit?
So for a Chapter 7, it stays on your record for 10 years. For a Chapter 13, it stays on your record for 7 years. Most negative things stay on for 10 years, for 7 years. So Chapter 7 is one of those that stays on longer. But it doesn't ruin you for a full 10 years is something I want to make clear for people, because I think a lot of people have this stigma against filing and they're so worried about their credit score when in fact sometimes this is kind of like your way out. This is a law that's designed to help you and you should take advantage of that if it'll help your particular situation. So most mortgage lenders we speak to say that they want at least 3 years to have passed after bankruptcy before they'll consider you for a home loan. Realistically, I've seen maybe 5 years out people buy a house. So it doesn't ruin you for 10 years, but
Okay.
it stays there for 10 years.
All right. So yeah, that stigma is in the back of my mind too. Everybody thinks that if you file for bankruptcy, you're ruined for the next 10 years, but that's not true.
No.
Okay. That's awesome. It was very informative. I know you're very busy, especially in these times. I appreciate you coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. I wanted the listeners and the viewers to learn more about it because we hear about bankruptcy in the news a lot these days. But even myself, I wasn't sure what the difference is. I wanted to find out myself and let the viewers know and the listeners as well. I appreciate it very much, Karine. And give us your phone number or your contact information one more time, please.
Sure. So my phone number is 323-426-8300. And my email is karine@kelawfirm.com. And thank you for taking the time to speak with me. I appreciate being a guest on your podcast.
Thank you for being on. I hope you have a good day.
Thank you. You too. Bye.